Discovering our Irish ancestry. What a wonderful project to work on. Good evening and welcome to all of you. The Irish monument you see here is located on the Gaspé Peninsula in eastern Quebec. It is a memorial to one of the Irish emigrant ships which did not reach its destination, and is an important part of the Irish ancestry of many descendants in the Gaspésie, Quebec, and beyond, including my own. The monument embodies the memory of the story of the Carricks of Whitehaven, one of the many emigrant ships from Ireland that left the port of Whitehaven in County Sligo in 1847. It was destined for Quebec City, but never made it to the quarantine station at Gros-Îles. Its voyage and tragic ending are one of the most documented voyages. This story begins in the 1840s in County Sligo, in the northwest of Ireland, where, as it was for many, life was not easy. As indicated on the map, Sligo is about 220 kilometers, or 135 miles northwest of Dublin. Two of the main parishes in Sligo were the Hamlish, North Sligo, about 14,500 acres, with a population of over 10,000, and Coolevin in South Sligo, about 5,400 acres. While only 30 miles or 48 kilometers apart, it seemed a much greater distance in 1847. Only half the land in the Hamlish parish was suitable for planting crops. It was filled with bogs, sand dunes, or was just marshy or of poor quality. This meant the available land for agriculture was too densely populated and heavily subdivided, resulting in there not being enough land for inhabitants to raise sufficient crops. And then came the Great Potato Famine. As Cecil Woodman Smith wrote in The Great Hunger, the Great Potato Famine of 1846 is the classic example of an outbreak of blight, and the people of Ireland, gazing over their blackened fields, despaired. 1847 was the beginning of the third year of the blight, and in the best of times, it was estimated that it would take 1 acre of land to feed a family of 6 or 7 for a year. But this meant just basic survival, leaving inhabitants malnourished. Once the potato blight hit, the famine left them without their main source of food and without the ability to pay their bills, most notably their rent as tenant farmers. A virulent outbreak of fever also hit Sligo in March 1847, striking down many with cholera, typhoid, and dysentery. Faced with a battle of hunger and disease, it brought them to a desperate solution they never thought possible, and that was to leave Ireland, leaving behind everything and everyone they knew. Lord Palmerston, a powerful British politician, owned a large amount of land in County Sligo, as well as some land in Dublin. Who was Lord Palmerston? His actual name is Henry John Temple, and he lived from 1784 to 1865. He was a British politician who served twice as Prime Minister. He proclaimed his assertive foreign policy was a model for the world to follow. His wealth gave him the means to erect Classy Bond Castle in Mullimore Village in County Sligo. As a landlord, Lord Palmerston owned 12,500 acres with a population of almost 10,000 in a hamlish, as well as most of the land in the smaller Coolevin parish. These were managed for him by his lawyers in Dublin and his land agents in Sligo, notably J. Kincaid. Under the advice of Kincaid, Lord Palmerston attempted squaring land, reorganizing, moving middlemen to create smaller, more consolidated farms, but it was not enough to provide for the population on the land. So they turned to assisted emigration. This was a government program that had been in place for several years. In 1847, landlords like Palmerston decided to make use of the program to rid their land of tenants who could not pay their rent. They would pay passage for their tenant farmers to a new life in the United States, British North America, or New Brunswick. Under the advice of his land agents, it was deemed it was less expensive for Lord Palmerston to pay for their passage to North America than to keep them as tenant farmers. I have a technical difficulty. Joe, I have a technical difficulty. In 1847, Lord Palmerston leased 9 sailing vessels that would transport more than 2,000 passengers for both Ahamlish in North Sligo and Coolivin in South Sligo through assisted emigration. Their meals and passage were paid. Yeah. Okay. Okay, I'll make sure that...
Red or green, it's going to work.
Yeah, okay. Thank you. Their meals and passage were paid. It is not known if Lord Palmerston, unlike some other landlords, gave them any money for life in their new land. The Carricks of Whitehaven was the first of Lord Palmerston's ships to leave Sligo. So on April 3rd or 4th, residents of Sligo made their way to the port to board the Carricks. Known as the Sligo Famine Walk, this journey of approximately 32 kilometers or 20 miles often took more than a day. The Carricks was scheduled to leave port on April 4, 1847, filled with passengers hoping for a new life in North America. Some were ill and all were tired and hungry, but were given little choice. They would board the Carricks full of hope, prepared for their 2,000-mile sea voyage across the Atlantic to their destination, the quarantine station at Grosse Ile. They lived with the poor conditions provided to them on the Carricks and could not even imagine the destiny that awaited them. What type of ship was the Carricks? It was a timber-built sailing vessel. All the vessels taking passengers from Sligo to North America were wooden cargo ships, often called timber draugers, that were used to carry timber from North America to ports in Ireland and Britain. To maximize profits, they would be refitted to carry passengers upon return to North America. Built in 1812, it was a 2-mast brig weighing 242 tons. Sailings from the port of Sligo began in January 1847, and 64 of this type would carry over 13,000 emigrants to North America, mostly to Quebec and New Brunswick. At the time, much of the United States was closed to emigrants due to quarantine restrictions. Since they were timber-built vessels, the ships would be refitted to return with passengers. These ships were essentially shells with no compartments other than the captain's quarter and the crew's quarters. They are often referred to as coffin ships. A temporary deck was laid about 6 feet below the main deck, and this gave a space of about 95 by 25 feet in the smaller brigs. This created 2 tiers of wooden berths, about 6 by 6 feet on either side, with an additional row in the middle. There were no portholes or any means of ventilation except for the hatchways, which allowed some light and air to enter the ship. In bad weather, the hatchways had to be closed. These were not very comfortable conditions for such a long voyage. The smaller size of the ship, like the Carricks, was approved to carry 240 passengers. Larger ships could carry up to 500 passengers. The passenger list. There is a bit of discrepancy on the number of passengers who sailed on the Carricks, depending on the source. The list shown here of 173 passengers is the one provided to the Immigration Authorities, British North America. It is published in the book Sligo's Famine Diaspora, Emigrants from Palmerston's Sligo Estate, 1847, by John McKeon. Other Canadian records show that there were as many as 180 to 187 passengers, which would include the crew. It is well documented that 9 passengers died en route. As you can see, the passengers are from 10 different townlands, listed by head of family as male, or if female, identified as widowed. For example, widow Biddy O'Connor and family. Other family names there include Brennan, Murray, Gallagher, and Mullen. They were from 28 different families, the majority from 5 townlands. It is important to note that the largest family was from Drumfarnot, Owen Healy with a family of 10. In fact, 7 of the 10 tenant farmers in Drumfarnot agreed to make the voyage for a total of 48 passengers, more than any other township. This left only 3 tenant farmers in Drumfarnot. Other townships to remark are the family of Patrick Kavanagh, one of 2 families from Cross, and the 2 Kieran families from Drumfarnot. So they're a little further down the list. Most of the major, a great number came from Drumfarnot, which is the first list that you see. The voyage, and they set off. These 180 plus passengers would be crowded into the small wooden berths of the Carricks for the 2,000-mile voyage to their new life. They could not imagine that for most of them, their voyage would only last 3 weeks and 3 days. On April 28, 1847, the brig, the Carricks, went off course and hit a reef on a cold, windy, snowy night and crashed into the rocky shoreline at Cap-des-Rosiers on the Gaspé Peninsula. Some report a snowstorm and strong winds that blew down from the Arctic, which meant the crew could not get the sails down in time, and the ship rolled before crashing. Whatever the cause of the crash, only 48 passengers would survive the sinking. To give you a perspective on the Gaspé Peninsula and the location of the wreck, here are maps of the area. The Gaspé Peninsula is located in eastern Quebec. It is approximately 700 kilometers from Quebec City, about an 8-hour drive along the St. Lawrence River to the city of Gaspé at the tip of the peninsula. It is the birthplace of Canada. It is a very scenic drive along the water with picturesque views of coastal villages. If you leave Gaspé and drive approximately 310 kilometers down the coast, you will arrive at the New Brunswick border, Campbellton, New Brunswick. The meaning of Gaspé from the Mi'kmaq word Gaspé is land's end. Appalachian Mountains meet the sea. This map is a closer look at the location of the wreck. All the locations on this map are important to the survivors. To begin, the site of the Carrick sinking. Cap-des-Rosiers is a picturesque village located northeast of Gaspé Center. It is situated between 2 other villages, Cap-aux-Eaux and Lanceau-Griffon, on the Gulf of the St. Lawrence. It gives access to one of the main entrances to Forêt National Park. Not far away, St. Majoric would be found as you go inland along Route 132. So St. Majoric is not marked, but where you see the 132 sign, it would be just above that. It is a village that stretches over several kilometers and has a picturesque view of the Dartmouth River. A long bridge over the river provides easy passage to the city of Gaspé. The distance from St. Majoric to Cap-des-Rosiers is approximately 33 kilometers. Continuing further along Route 132, you see the city of Gaspé, about 40 kilometers from Cap-des-Rosiers. Gaspé is the main center with a population of about 15,000 spread over 1,400 square kilometers stretching from Fort Prevel. So Fort Prevel would be just above Saint-Georges-de-Malbaie, and it stretches all the way to Rivière-Renard, which you see on the map. Traveling a bit further down the coast along Route 132, about 20 kilometers from Gaspé, we find Douglastown. So Douglastown is not indicated, but it will be just slightly above La Sabriand. La Sabriand is actually part of Douglastown. It is an Irish community and was established in 1775. In 1783, there were only 8 Catholic families in the parish. This increased consistently over the years as the number of Irish inhabitants increased. So I grew up in Douglastown. I attended St. Patrick's Elementary School and St. Patrick's Church. You will find many Irish names in the parish: Kennedy, Holland, Rooney, Mulrooney, Walsh, and O'Brien, among others. There is a large Irish spirit in Douglastown yet today. I'm including the photos of present-day Cap-des-Rosiers so you can see the waters of the St. Lawrence where the Carricks sank. The lighthouse stands on the cliff overlooking the tumultuous waters where the mouth of the St. Lawrence enters the Gulf of the St. Lawrence. And there is a long stretch of beach just below the cliff. You can see how the survivors of the Carricks would have identified with the coastline and its familiarity to home. Of note here is the lighthouse that now stands as a towering structure, but was not yet built in 1847 when the Carricks sank. It is located only 0.4 kilometers or a quarter of a mile from the Carricks' present-day monument. The Cap-des-Rosiers lighthouse was built during a 5-year project with construction being completed in 1858, perhaps as a result of the Carricks sinking. At 112 feet and over 24 meters high, it is the tallest lighthouse in Canada. Its walls at the base are 7 feet thick and have a depth of 8 feet below ground. It was deemed a National Historic Site in 1973 and a Federal Heritage Building in 1994. It now stands in present day as proud guardian over the Carricks Monument. Following the sinking of the Carricks in these waters, many questions were raised asking how and why this happened. This is the note from the captain, published in the Liverpool Mercury, a weekly newspaper out of England that published the news from its busy port less than 2 months after the sinking. Cap-des-Rosiers, 19th of May, 1847. I am sorry to inform you that the brig Carricks was wrecked about 4 miles to the eastward of this place. Out of 167 passengers, only 48 reached shore. The crew, except 1 boy, were all saved. R. Thompson, the Liverpool Mercury, 29th of June, 1847. No reasons for the sinking were given. John McKeon has acknowledged this question in his book, Sligo's Famine Diaspora. They had sailed the Carricks regularly in these waters, frequently sailing to and from Europe with timber on the outward journey and occasionally taking passengers back. As experienced sailors and having successfully crossed the Atlantic with their emigrants, crew members would have known the dangers of being too close to the Cap-des-Rosiers in storms, and they would be expected to give the Cap a wide berth in bad weather. But whatever caused the disaster, this sinking was the worst possible start to the large-scale emigration program planned that year. News of the tragedy spread quickly throughout the towns and villages around Gaspé. Local fishermen rushed to help the passengers, but found that many had not survived, and they were left making their way through the bodies that were strewn along the beach. Quebec's Morning Chronicle newspaper on May 15th reported the loss of 119 passengers and 1 crew member. It is well documented that Father Michael Dowling, the parish priest from St. Patrick's Parish in Douglastown, was carrying out a mission in churches in Grand Grave, just a few miles from the wreck. He rushed to the scene at Cap-des-Rosiers, and walking along the beach littered with bodies, he took off his own shoes and gave them to a survivor whose feet were battered and bleeding. Father Dowling would also bring some of the survivors to Douglastown for shelter. The Whalen and Packwood families of Cap-des-Rosiers also sheltered some of the survivors in the days following the sinking. It seems that Father Dowling was so affected by the tragedy that he was never the same afterwards and returned to Quebec City permanently. 2 more ships left Sligo in May 1847 before news of the sinking spread in Ireland. At least 6 more ships left the port of Sligo that year. 5 would go to Quebec and 3 to New Brunswick. After the shipwreck, it is confirmed that 119 did not survive. 87 bodies washed ashore and were buried on Cap-des-Rosiers beach. Local fishermen used 2 ox carts to carry the dead and bury them in a mass grave over the next couple of days. Of the 48 survivors, 12 remained in Gaspé. The remaining 36 left for their original destination of Quebec within a few months, by early summer. 21 left on the Maria Julia on July 8. A week later, 15 left on the Emerald. After these 36 were checked at the quarantine station at Grosse Ile, those who were in good health could stay in Quebec City or move on to Montreal, Toronto, New York, or Boston. As a side note, little is known about where the 36 survivors who left Gaspé found their permanent home, except for one O'Boyle family who survived and settled in New York. My research shows that possibly only 2 would have stayed in Quebec City. There are no names attached, and it seems that much of this information has been lost. The other 12 survivors remained in Gaspé and were sheltered and looked after by the generosity and kindness of local families. Remaining in Gaspé meant dealing with snowy winters, some language barriers, and relying more on logging and fishing as a livelihood, a way of life that was new to them. Who remained in Gaspé? 8 of the 12 who remained in Gaspé are known, notably Pat Cavaney, 3 members of his family from Cross, Bridget Healy Crummy, daughter of Owen Healy. 4 out of 10 members of her family survived from Drumfarnot, the largest family on the ship. Bridget Kieran, the only member of her family to survive from Drumfarnot. There is some information about her life after. She married Matthew Adams of St. Majoric, Gaspé. Together they raised 9 children. She is a cousin to Bridget Healy Crummy and actually lived with her for a while in St. Majoric. While there is little known about the Kieran family, there is much more known about the Cavaney and Healy Crummy family members who survived. The story of Patrick Cavaney. Sarah McDonald and her husband, Patrick Cavaney, now Kavanagh, were on board the ship with their 6 children, their son Martin and 5 daughters. While Patrick and Sarah survived the sinking with their 16-year-old son Martin, their 5 daughters, aged 2 to 10, perished. Patrick and Sarah, with their son Martin, were given shelter in Cap-des-Rosiers, then moved further up the coast to Cloridome, where a second son, Patrick Jr., was born in 1848. They then returned to settle permanently in Cap-des-Rosiers, where they had 3 more children, Dominic, James, and Maggie. However, more tragedy would strike this family. In 1855, Patrick, wanting to celebrate the feast of St. Patrick's with his fellow Irishmen in Douglastown, set out on foot to cross the frozen bay. Surprised by a snowstorm, he lost his way and did not return the following day as planned. Neighbors, sadly, found his frozen body on the bay. The Kavanagh children would grow up and settle in Cap-des-Rosiers. Several of the Kavanagh descendants are deeply interested in their Irish ancestry, and a documentary film has been made recounting their journey back to Ireland. The film title, originally named The Lost Children of the Carricks, is now being revamped under the title The Unquiet Ghosts of the Carricks. Directed by Professor Geroid O'Halloran, Johnson Chair in Quebec Irish Studies of Concordia University, and Peter Murphy of Seabright Publications, the documentary retraces the descendant George Kavanagh, who has remained in Cap-des-Rosiers, and his family as they travel back to the place of the homestead of Patrick Kavanagh in Sligo. The documentary, released in 2020, also gives extensive historical background as to why these families were faced with little choice except to emigrate to North America. I've seen the documentary. It was launched in Gaspé originally, and it's very interesting. Then there is the story of Mrs. Crummy from Ireland. While there are few accounts documenting the survivors, much of the knowledge about this survivor came from this note in my grandfather's family Bible, Albert Moran. It gives great insight to my great-great-grandmother, Bridget Healy Crummy, daughter of Owen Healy. The note reads, John Adams, widower, married Mrs. Crummy from Ireland, wrecked on Cap-des-Rosiers in 1847 on the brig Carricks. Mrs. Crummy lost mother, father, and some of the family. She saved daughter Biddy, aged 12, and also son Tom. They stayed in the upper bunk of brig's Carricks in a space of 4 feet water to deck on low tide of the vessel. Oliver Jacques and Mr. Quinton heard them crying. They chopped a hole in the deck and hauled them out. The note confirms and explains how she survived with 2 of her children, Bridget or Biddy, aged 12, and son Tom. It has also been confirmed that baby Anne, 3 years old, survived. The note also describes being chopped out of the deck, and seeing how the ship was refitted with wooden berths to accommodate passengers, it seems very logical. She would have remained in the upright part of the ship above the water in a space of about 4 feet, and there was found by locals in their rescue efforts in the early morning. It has also been documented that a 12-year-old Bridget or Biddy, who survived the wreck, later told the story that her father Patrick and her other siblings were also in the same upper deck, and all could have been saved. But one of the children, with another child in her arms, seeing the boards floating on the water, stepped on them. Patrick plunged into the icy water to save his children, and sadly also perished. A local Gaspé legend is that Bridget Healy Crummy, once rescued, floated to shore on her hoop skirt with baby Anne clinging to her, her daughter. This local legend is known as Floating Biddy. It is one of my family's favorite stories. So, what happened to Bridget Healy Crummy? Widowed, she decided to stay in Gaspé with her 3 children. How difficult it must have been for her after suffering the loss of her husband, her parents, and 3 of her children. There is little known about where or how she lived in Gaspé for the 2 years before she married again on May 14, 1849, to John Adams, a widower who already had 8 children. They were married in St. Patrick's Church, Douglastown. John had already lost his wife and a baby daughter. They would settle in St. Majoric, where John was a carpenter and farmer. Together, they had 5 more children: Eleanor, Mary Jane, John, James, and Elias. Baby John died in infancy. Bridget and John Adams created a family of 15 children. It has been noted that neither he nor Bridget had time to grieve or dwell on the past. Quite a story. 15 children. Let me introduce you to part of my family tree with this photo. Here you see my great-grandmother, Mary Jane Adams, daughter of Bridget Healy Crummy, her husband, Philip Moran, and their 3 children. At her feet, this adorable little gentleman in his leather boots is my grandfather, Albert Moran. His sister, Annie, stands to your left, and his brother, baby George, is in his mother's arms. This photo was taken in Manchester, New Hampshire. The family left their homestead in Gaspé to work there temporarily, intending to return. My grandfather was the oldest of the 3 siblings. Fast forward 70 plus years. This photo shows my grandfather, Albert Moran, sitting on the Carricks monument in Cap-des-Rosiers in 1959 with my Aunt Mildred, my mom's sister. He is still handsome in his Irish peak cap. Remark the building to the left of this photo. It no longer appears in present-day photos of the monument. Due to the threat of coastal erosion, the monument was moved away from the shoreline to more secure land in 2017. The Carricks Monument has become a focal point for descendants. In 1900, Father John Quinlivan, parish priest of St. Patrick's Church in Montreal, and his parishioners arranged for the purchase and installation of the monument. In the shape of a cross, its inscription reads, "Sacred to the memory of 187 Irish immigrants from Sligo wrecked here on April 28, 1847, ship Carricks of Whitehaven, 87 are buried here. Pray for their souls." The bell of the Carricks, seen in this photo, is now encased in a smaller monument next to the cross. Its inscription reads that it was found by Mr. Alphonse Rouet in Blanc on the North Shore, 336 miles or 540 kilometers from the site of the tragedy on September 24, 1966, 119 years after the sinking. I have other pictures of the monument. How did St. Patrick's Parish in Montreal hear of this tragedy? Research shows that Bridget Healy Crummy's 12-year-old daughter, Biddy, who survived the shipwreck, was living in Gaspé. She later married William Fingleton and moved to Montreal in 1891. Widowed in 1894, she moved to a Vibert household in Westmount. It was during this period that she attended St. Patrick's Church for Mass and told them the story of the sinking of the Carricks. Father Quinlivan, upon hearing of the tragedy, was moved to act. In the early 1990s, Monsignor Russell Breen of St. Patrick's, Montreal, visited the monument and seeing it weathered from exposure to the elements, had the site enhanced and the inscription retouched. Bridget, or Biddy Crummy Fingleton, would return to Gaspé alone and spend her final days living there. My mom, when she was very young, remembers visiting this elderly lady, her great aunt, with her father, Albert Moran. Biddy was his godmother. Biddy died in Gaspé at the age of 93 in 1928. And I've seen a lot of research where she's been quoted because she actually had memories of the Carrick sinking. Her brother Tom, who survived the wreck, despite his sea tragedy, became a sailor. He married in Ontario, and later widowed, he lived with his daughter in Iowa. Her sister Anne, who survived, remained in Gaspé, never married, and died at the age of 34 in 1878. The Carricks Monument is located in the north sector of Forêt National Park and is now under the care of Parks Canada. The brass plaque you see here, listing the names of the passengers, was installed in the monument in 1977, the year Forêt National Park was inaugurated. The title of the plaque is Carried by Hope. Part of the inscription reads, "This commemorative plaque honors the families that risked everything in hopes of rebuilding their lives in North America." And while it could seem that this could be the end of the Carrick story, it is not. A major discovery was to be made. Local residents always believed that Cap-des-Rosiers beach was a burial site for Carrick's victims. But it was only in 2011, when the bones of 3 children washed ashore, that they gained the attention of Parks Canada. A coroner determined that 2 of the bones were from children aged between 9 and 11, and 1 between the ages of 12 to 15. This discovery promptly halted beach restoration planned by Parks Canada. Archaeologists for Parks Canada began a large-scale excavation that lasted for more than 5 years. The excavation revealed the bones of another 18 individuals by 2016. The photo that I show you here is an actual photo of the excavation taken by CBC News. It was very delicate work. After being buried on a rocky beach covered with salt water for more than 160 years, the bones had deteriorated to fragmentary and fragile pieces. Sometimes there were only teeth or 1% of a skeleton. The remains were sent to Parks Canada offices in Ottawa and then to the Department of Bioarchaeology at the Université de Montréal for analysis. Locally, there was much speculation and hypothesis as local residents patiently awaited the results. The excavation was widely covered by the media throughout the province. Finally, on June 7, 2019, it was confirmed that the remains found on Cap-des-Rosiers beach were indeed victims of the Carricks. This conclusion was reached due to the dedicated research and analysis by professors, notably Dr. Isabelle Ribaud, and the graduate students at the Université de Montréal. The scientists presented the final report on their research at a conference which I attended in Forêt National Park in the autumn of 2023. Of the 18 individuals discovered, there were 9 adults, mostly women, 3 adolescents, and 6 children. They determined that these victims were suffering from malnutrition, clearly showing a lack of protein from an agricultural diet. One limb even showed suffering from rickets, a lack of vitamin D. The results were very typical of a diet for a rural population. While it was hopeful that the study could continue to reveal DNA to establish a link to living relatives, it was determined that the bones were too fragmentary. So on July 4, 2019, just a month after the bones were confirmed as victims of the Carricks, the remains of the 21 passengers were given their final resting place. They were buried in the small white coffin you see here, just behind the monument on the water side. The ceremony was respectful, thought-provoking, and heartfelt. It brought a great deal of closure to the families who had remained in the area. Since my great-great-grandmother, Bridget Healy Crummey, lived her life with her husband, John Adams, in St. Majoric, It is fitting that she and her husband's final resting place is in St. Majoric Cemetery, close to the monument and the site of the wreck. Bridget Healy Crummy died on May 29, 1888, at the age of 77. Her husband, John Adams, died in 1899. The Carricks also found its final resting place as the wreck was offered for sale a month after its sinking. Following the sinking of the Carricks, the Exchange Register in May 1847 noted, "Little will be saved, but what there is, together with the wreck, will be sold for the benefit of all concerned on Saturday next." In 1847, 64 ships sailed from the port of Sligo, carrying over 13,000 Irish emigrants to North America. While other ships got into trouble on their voyages that year, the sinking of the Carricks has been more well documented, due in large part to the number of children and young adults who lost their lives, and to the concern of local residents who kept the story of the sinking alive through oral history. The story of the Carricks is so important to my family's ancestry. I only came to know many of the details of the Carrick sinking in the last 18 years or so because a family friend, an avid genealogist, researched the story of the Carricks, highlighting my family's connection to the tragedy. She also had access to my grandfather's Bible. She is Peggy O'Reilly Sclater of Montreal. As my interest grew, the more I researched the Carricks, the more I wondered why my grandfather, who was a great storyteller, spoke very little of it. One answer is that being the youngest of 6 children in my family, I was only 14 when my grandfather passed away at the age of almost 90. This means I never got a chance to have those important conversations. As so often happens, the people who can answer questions about our ancestry are gone before we realize we need to know the answers. However, through my research, I realize now that he never got to meet his Irish grandmother, survivor of the Carricks. He was born in 1886, and Bridget Healy Crummy died in 1888 at the age of 77. My grandfather would have only been 2 years old. No wonder he referred to her as Mrs. Crummy in his Bible. Also, he and his siblings were orphaned at a young age. It's a very sad story. So he never really got to know his mother. His direct connection to the Carricks and the stories that could have been told were lost forever. Fortunately, however, I did have the opportunity to share our Carricks ancestry with my mom, Frida Moran, because she lived a long life to almost 96 years old, and we had that time. Okay. So I have also been very fortunate to learn from other descendants and share my family's ancestry with them. Most notably, in this photo in the center is Rosemarie Kilbride, and to her right, her husband, Terry Stanley. Rosemarie is a 5th-generation descendant of Patrick Kavanagh. My son Ryan was working at the museum in Gaspé as a summer student, and he called me one day to say, "There's this lady here interested in the Carricks. Can you come over?" It was boiling hot in July. It was the last thing I wanted to do, and it was not the first time this had happened. Fortunately, I went, because Rosemarie and Terry, originally residents on the coast, are enthusiastic genealogists who have researched extensively their family ancestry, and they provided me with invaluable sources of information. The other family in this photo is the Connolly family from Pennsylvania. They are descendants of the O'Boyle family who survived the sinking of the Carricks and later moved to New York. They were there to meet Rosemarie and Terry, and they were seeking answers in the museum's archives. 3 families, all descendants of the Carricks, found themselves at the Gaspé Museum on the same day. This photo was taken to mark that rare occasion. I have thoroughly enjoyed researching this presentation and having the opportunity to share it with you. So I would like to leave you with this Irish proverb. A heritage of thoughts is to be found in the proverbs of our ancestors. This presentation would not have been possible without the dedicated research of those listed here. I'm just going to highlight a few of these. Obviously, John McKeon's Sligo's Famine Diaspora is invaluable. And of particular note is John McKeon's 5-page journalistic article on Bridget Healy Crummey, my great-great-grandmother, published in the Coran Herald in Ireland in 2021-22. It details most of her life in Ireland before the voyage and much of her life in Gaspé afterwards. Peggy O'Reilly Sclater, who wrote a number of articles on the Carricks shipwreck and was the first to present my family's connection to the Carricks at the Douglastown Irish Days. Rosemary Kilbride and Terry Stanley provided me with all the information I have from John McKeon, as well as writing a series of articles discovering our ancestors in the Gaspé Spec, our local English newspaper. The other articles from La Farion is from the Francophone newspaper in Gaspé. These have been very, very useful, especially on the beach excavation and the discovery of the bones. I would also like to acknowledge the great help of my son, Ryan, in designing the PowerPoint. I don't have that ability. I would be happy to hear any comments or answer any questions you may have. Thank you for listening.